So now we'll talk about why it is that we haven't realized most of the information that I've shared in the previous videos, and then even when we're exposed to it, why it is so hard for us to grasp it. During most of the timeline of evolution and during the time that humans, Homo sapiens, have existed on the planet, the circumstances were very different. So, first of all, you could count on the general background to remain the same. If you were born during an ice age, you could expect that it would stay an ice age for the duration of your lifetime. Or if you were born in a rainforest, then probably for the rest of your life, that would be a rainforest. The next thing is that we didn't have time to sit around and analyze things forever because then, the animal that you were hunting would run away, or the thing that was about to prey on you would get you, or whatever. And so we can't analyze forever. We kind of have to make snap judgments based on the information available to us, and even if that means having a more simplistic understanding. And finally, um, for humans specifically, survival was a team effort. And so one of the best investments you could make is in group harmony and making sure that they accept you. And that often means that you could also trust their judgment and just go along with it. And you wanted to constantly prioritize getting along with everyone. And now we will see how those have created biases in our brains and behaviors that are totally not suited for the circumstances that we find ourselves in now, because humans collaborating as a civilization have brought about conditions on this planet that are unprecedented for us, with things that we have changed, rapid change that we have never experienced before. And so suddenly our ways of moving through the world and understanding it and interacting with it are not suited to the predicament that we are finding ourselves in. So here are a few classic biases, which you might remember from Psych 101, that have some relevance to our current predicament and our inability to grasp it or act like it's real, even if we do grasp it. The first one is black and white thinking. So we have a tendency to like to be able to take action. And the way that you take action is by not spending too much time wrestling with complicated matters. You just kind of try to identify a good guy, a bad guy, a problem, a solution, and then we move forward with it. And we don't like gray areas, because those keep us inactive. Because then it's not so clear what the right move would be, which is actually the case now. Next up is loss aversion. It hurts more to lose something than it feels good to gain something. So losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good. We'll see the relevance of that in a second. Also, sunk cost fallacy. When you invest a lot in something, we're prone to want to cling to it, even if all the signals say that it's time to give it up and move on to something else. And hyperbolic discounting, which is where things in the future feel fainter than things that we are experiencing in the present. And so you might anticipate, I'm just gonna say pain. Extreme pain in the future might actually, you would in your calculations, you would value that as insignificant compared to any kind of discomfort that you are feeling in the present. So taken all together, those last three, first of all, adapting, living as if civilization really is going to end, requires that you stop pursuing certain markers of success in our society that are soon to become obsolete. But it kind of it sucks to do that. And because of how we calculate consequences, you're looking at the sunk cost, the amount of investment that you've made in becoming a professional in your career, or the amount of time you spent working to afford a house in a location that is soon going to be uninhabitable. And that will cause you to stick with that, when in fact the suffering that is going to bring to you in the future is greater than if you just bit the bullet right now and dealt with the shame of giving up on your career on Wall Street. And then of course, that is going to bring the pain of in the future is going to be greater, but you just aren't perceiving how extreme that is now. And then also confirmation bias. So after you make that calculation, well, now you're having to deal with all this inner conflict. You're feeling a lot of fear and anxiety, and you're wanting to suppress that. So you are going to prioritize, as opposed to actual reality acknowledging, reality aligned action, you are going to prioritize just the immediate relief from the negative feelings. You're going to find ways to suppress them. And so we will look for messages that confirm what we want to believe. And if you look for them, they are out there. And I have examples of that in my next video. Actually, also in this one. And then Dunning-Kruger effect. This is fun. So people who know the least about how complicated a situation is will have the most confidence, because obviously they aren't even aware of what they don't know. And so the result of that is we have a bunch of people out in the field right now speaking very loudly about what is going to solve this, but they actually don't know what they're talking about, but they don't realize it. And so they just have confidence. And that is very compelling to people who want to trust them as experts. The next one is normalcy bias. So a very extreme example of this is there were once some planes that collided on a runway, and after a few minutes they caught fire and exploded. And some people unbuckled themselves after the collision and got out before it was too late. A bunch of other people stayed buckled in. I have the link to the article about this in my Substack. And the thing that the people who stayed buckled in were experiencing is normalcy bias. When something is too mind-blowing, we resist it. We cannot even like process, and we just tell ourselves this can't possibly be happening to me. And that keeps us paralyzed, keeps us from being able to act. The other thing is receding goalpost or shifting baseline. So because these changes are happening somewhat gradually, still way faster than they ever did in history, but whatever, we don't perceive the changes that are happening in the background. And so unless you stop and think and like compare the state of the world today to the way that it was 50 years ago, for example, that World Wildlife Fund article where they're like, oh yeah, we've lost 70%, 70% of wildlife. Oops. It's imperceptible to us. And so we just dismiss it. Informational social influence. So another experiment with this one is like they pumped smoke under a door into a room, but like no one wanted to say anything about it. And so then no one said anything about it because we're all looking around and being like, you don't want to be the crazy person in the room. So nobody wants to say anything, but then we're all thinking the same thing. And then what should be said doesn't get said. And that leads into my next slide about people censoring themselves. But anyway, it is working against us because everyone should be raising the alarm, and yet no one is because of social pressure. And finally, mortality salience and worldview defense. So we as a species are aware of the fact that we are mortal and we die one day. And the way that we feel better about that is by having faith in legacy, heritage, and legacy. And so, maybe I die, but I can kind of live on in these things that existed long before me and will continue to exist long after me. It is comforting to feel like you are part of something bigger than yourself that actually comforts us about our own finite lifetime. And so then to contemplate the idea that actually all of these elements of civilization are going to be going away, and like we are actually going to be alive to experience that and witness it, is way too jarring for us, because it's like one thing to face the fact that you are going to die, but then to also face the fact that everything that is familiar to you is also going to go away, and everything that we've worked towards and are proud of and that forms our identity as a species is going to go away. That's a bit too much for us to handle, so we just don't think about it. First, just a few more psychological things that don't actually have a term for them. I like these quotes by Ian McGilchrist. He has a book called The Master and His Emissary. Or if, like me, you didn't want to bother to read the book, he also has some talks that are on YouTube. So these are some quotes from those. He talks about, at this point, it's not really the left brain, right brain theory doesn't literally apply, and yet there are different ways of thinking about the world, and our culture has a left-brained way of thinking about it, even if it isn't technically our left brain, but like the method of thinking that we associate with that is the one that is dominant among us. And so we pay narrow beam attention, focused on the detail that we already know and desire and are intent on grabbing, simplified in the service of manipulation, devoid of context, disembodied. Such logic will be unreasonably optimistic and fails to see the dangers that loom. The meta-crisis is the predictable outcome of a complete failure to understand what a human being is, what the world is, and what one has to do with the other. So, like, I'm gonna bring up the spaceship analogy again. We're all living on this spaceship. We are doing our duties within the pods, and we don't really understand what our participation in this is all adding up to cumulatively, nor do we understand the relationship that the spaceship has with its host planet, and we are all just focused on like improving it, whether you are going from like a social activism social justice activism angle or an engineering angle. It's all about improving the spaceship, but that doesn't really address what is the core problem here. And then also a study finding is that if you base your whole identity and sense of belonging on something, you are going to challenge anything that threatens that something. And then also the classic Upton Sinclair quote that it's hard to convince a man to understand something that his salary depends on him not understanding. So moving on from our brains to our culture, one of the first things that leads us to be incapable of understanding how we could possibly be the problem and our lifestyle is not going to last forever is that from the early stage of education all through the type of things that we watch as adults, whether it is coverage of real life events or fictional entertainment, it's basically about humans who are meeting their survival needs through civilization as if there is no other life form on the planet, unless you're watching, fun, entertaining videos of other animals or a nature documentary. The next thing, the linear progress myth, is just this idea that everything is going to continue advancing forever and getting better and better, and we never lose. Next up, narrow definitions of success and sacrifice. So the thing is, thinking narrowly from our perspective, for us, whenever, there's the thing that we might define as success, but because it's always a trade-off, whenever we succeed, most other life on Earth suffers. And we've been doing that for a really long time. So now it's all been pushed. There's this huge imbalance of like, because of how many times we have succeeded. And then also by the same token, sacrifice. We consider it sacrifice when we maybe back down from this plan to pursue a Green New Deal. But other species would like it if once in a while civilization would admit defeat and stop trying to continue extracting resources from their habitats. Another thing, specialization silos and techno-idolatry and the myth of authority. So the way that civilization is designed with people who are specialists and each one has their specific job and of course, the division of labor, it discourages people from understanding the big picture because instead you have your little specific expertise area that you're supposed to just focus on and get really good at, and therefore you don't have time or even like the skills, the critical thinking skills or whatever, to understand the whole picture and how everything fits together. And then maybe this thing that you are super nerdy about isn't actually going to save the world as much as you think it is. And then techno-idolatry. So like there are a ton of sciences, and we always like to say like believe the science. Absolutely, I agree. The thing is we are selective about which sciences we like. We like technology, we like engineering, we like to hear about robotics and AI and how that's going to get us out of this mess. But the thing is, those sciences and industries require material extraction from the planet. So like that's a no-go. We can't keep doing that to solve the problem. It's that doing that is going to make the problem worse, and yet we like those industries and those fields, so we want to see them be the ones who are going to be able to rescue us. Meanwhile, other sciences are like sounding the alarm and pointing out how that's not going to work and whatever, but we're kind of just like blocking that all out and forgetting that that is also a science and a source of information and truth and wisdom. And then also the myth of authority. So that is where we trust everyone to know what they're talking about. But in everyone's department of work, there's that person that you're like, how did they ever get fired, and how are they still employed, because they just don't actually know what they're doing. And those people exist everywhere, including in the fields that are supposed to be saving us. So, for example, number one, and I have links about this in my Substack. Number one, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's IPCC, when they prepare their reports, they trust the IEA, the International Energy Agency, to provide them with accurate data when they make their models about what we should be expecting the climate to do. But one of the assumptions, which is clearly disproven as soon as you look at all of history, and I've mentioned this in article or in post number 2, as well as in my Substack. There's links to a person who's doing a good job of explaining it. Efficiency makes things worse, not better. And so basically, like, all of the IEA's projections are flipped. They show things getting better as a result of efficiency, whereas they should actually show things getting worse. And then that feeds into the IPCC's models, which make them inaccurate. And then here we are, all surprised, like those headline clippings in my 3rd video, where all the scientists are like, it's not supposed to be getting this bad this soon. Yeah, that's because you're using garbage in, garbage out data. Next up, toxic positivity. So in our culture, the only attitude that is acceptable is like this: we can do it, even if the truth is that this time around we can't. And it's like we're all out here with our chainsaws and our bulldozers and our backhoes, and we're like, we're unstoppable, Green New Deal, here we come. And all the other species are like, oh, could you actually like maybe try being stoppable this time? We would like if you would do that. And an ecologically aware citizen, such as you, now that you're my listeners, would find themselves in this catch-22, because, well, here are your options. You can root for the thing that everybody else is rooting for, but deep down you know that it is ecocidal and suicidal, which doesn't feel good, and it would be inauthentic for you to do. Or you'd be rooting against your home team, and then all your friends wouldn't like that. You would become the enemy. So it really puts you in a tough position. And it doesn't allow us, it creates no space to be honest. And then finally, pronatalism. So can't have civilization unless you have population density. And so this actually contributes to the whole mentality of just like humans first, always. And like all of that is part of our unconscious campaign to crowd out other species. We're not doing that intentionally. That's no one's intention when they have a kid. But when every single person does that, that's what it adds up to. And when I say pronatalism, it's this idea. So we're all familiar with the idea of like pro-life, pro-choice, but that is limited to birth control access, versus pronatalism acknowledges that there is more coercion happening subtly within our culture. That is, even if women have access to birth control, they aren't free to make the choice to not have kids. And so here are some examples. Is that, first of all, there's a myth that adulthood without kids you'll feel incomplete and unfulfilled if you don't do it, so you should. Also, that child-free adults are selfish, immature, and dysfunctional. TV shows portray them that way. Meanwhile, if you are a parent, but you were like, you know what, if I could go back, I wouldn't have had this kid, you're discouraged from ever expressing that. Like, generally, parenthood is celebrated as like something that you're definitely going to be sure that you're glad that you did. And then it's acceptable to ask a child-free person or to like chastise them and be like, oh, you're going to regret this decision. But like when you have the kids, it's not polite to ask a parent like, are you sure that was a good move? You don't think you're gonna like regret it in 20 years when the world is in whatever state it's in? And then finally, countries are even incentivizing births, or at least trying to. On my Substack, I have a whole link to multiple links to all of the policies that they are launching to try to like pay people to pop out more babies, because we need laborers and consumers. And then this is just pure hearsay, but if you head over to my Substack, I've got a bunch of quotes at the bottom of post 5.2 that are from things I've read and podcasts I've listened to, where the host will mention that when they hear from people publicly, everyone claims that we can keep this show on the road. But then in private, these figures of sometimes major corporations will confide that they actually don't see this functioning very well much longer. Just interesting. You know what they say, a picture's worth 1,000 lies. So somewhere along the way, we just started doing this great marketing push for clean technology. And because we used the right words and the right images, everyone has just asked no questions about what kind of environmental impact this industrial equipment has on the environment. So here we have pictures from all of these ostensibly environmental sources, for the most part. Sierra Club is calling clean industry. It says it's going to save lives and create jobs. I would argue that because it requires material extraction, which has to come out of from the environment and therefore destroys natural habitats, that it isn't saving lives on net. Another one is from the World Resource Institute. It's a nonprofit, but they have this amazing pop-up that then prompts you to donate when you go to their website. And look, it's got kids on a swing set while this like apocalyptic sunrise is happening, or maybe that's a sunset. But of course, it's got these wind turbines in the background, and they're saying to, protect our planet. These things don't protect our planet. They justify further destruction toward a project that isn't even going to last. You've got the UN saying that, all of these technologies are great. We're supposed to be hugging the backhoes and hugging the pylons as pictured here. These things aren't nature. They destroy nature. This is just insanity, but the marketing effort is real. So first of all, a recap. Here we are looking at these reasons why it is so hard for us to grasp that when we create more anthropogenic mass, from my first video, that was that grayish tower, we inevitably push down on biomass, which puts the planet in a worse position, and there's no way to make more anthropogenic mass without destroying the biomass. And as it is, there's already so little wildlife left, and that makes the whole situation, which we rely on for our food, fragile. And therefore, the whole civilization way of organizing ourselves is, because of its resource requirements and environmental impact, is net always detrimental to its own environment and designed to fail and cannot continue functioning much longer relative to the whole time scale. We're not able to process all of its information. And so then, in addition to our psychology preventing us from seeing that the way that our brains work, and then also from our culture prevents us from seeing that, also there's like this live ongoing effort now as we speak to distract us from that. And so one tactic in journalism, not that they're doing this intentionally, they're just really bad at their jobs, is carbon tunnel vision. And so that is this focus on, does the end product emit greenhouse gases? So the only box that you need to check to be able to say that something is climate friendly is, does it have a tailpipe? And never mind the other environmental impacts, because that's just not what we're writing about here. And then you can just basically dismiss them. And so in fact, you don't have to answer, well, does it solve all of the other problems? You don't, and then also you don't have to acknowledge that oftentimes it makes all those other problems worse. Because again, anthropogenic mass is coming from somewhere. Then this price tunnel vision. I've noticed that in the reporting on how climate is starting to impact the availability of goods, it will be conveyed in terms of how prices are rising. So they'll say, oh, the cacao bean harvest or the coffee bean harvest was lower this year, so these two products are going to be more expensive now, and that's going to hurt consumers' pockets. And I think that that protects us from having to face the fear of saying, oh my God, the production rate is going down and it's not stopping there. It's going to continue declining. Like, not eventually seeing empty shelves is a scary thought. But if the journalists just pitch it to you as like, oh, these things are getting more expensive, it's easier to deal with the fact of like, oh, I'm going to have to cut down on how many I can buy, or maybe I won't be able to afford it at all. But at least you can imagine that it will still be there and someone will be able to afford it. Whereas to contemplate the fact that these things are going to be going away is way too much of like an existential crisis. Sneaking in untrue clauses. For example, when they use words like the solar panel boom or all of these, the energy that we're generating with these technologies is soaring. Showing you again my little diagram or this chart here, very little of our energy is coming from them. We've not made progress. Of course, if we were to make progress, that would just correlate to more environmental damage. But we're not even achieving the thing that we think we're achieving if you like lower the bar for what that is, which is just the production of this equipment. And people just take their word for it and don't ask to see the numbers behind it. They'll also imply that switching to renewables weans us off of fossil fuels, which isn't true, which I've discussed in my second video. But because they say it, they like dedicate a sentence to that in the article, no explanation given, people just roll with it. Because everyone is busy and we don't all have time to research these things on our own, so we just trust them again to be informing us. And I'll have specific examples next. But finally, requisite happy endings. Sometimes I read an article or listen to a podcast and the whole thing is describing how much trouble we're in. And then at the end, they'll just end on a happy note like, but the climate fight isn't over and we can still win this. And it's like, they don't even have to, it's almost as if they were required to end with a happy note, like their editor wants to see that, and so they just throw it in there, but then they offer no details to justify that is the conclusion that they are reaching after just describing what all the challenges is and how this seems to be an insurmountable predicament. So now I'm going to present a few tricks. I don't know that they're necessarily tricks. Maybe it's somewhat intentional. That I've noticed in reporting about data that misrepresented. And so from now on, as you are reading about the success of the energy transition, you could be a little bit more of a shrewd information consumer. So the first one is comparing apples to oranges. And so in this chart, Hannah Ritchie shows us what the total weight of fossil fuels is that we burn in a year. And then she also shows us the total weight of renewable metals and minerals that we would need to complete the entire transition. And the thing is, though, that you aren't comparing the same thing, because to extract or mine the metals and minerals, we have to do disproportionate damage to the natural habitat. So all that I mean here, and like, you don't have to be an expert to realize this, is that although the little bit of metal and mineral that we're using at the end is small, take a look at this visual. It's not real, but it's a representation of the disproportionate damage that has to be done, the depth of the mine that has to be dug just to get a little bit of copper. And that's true in general, because obviously all of this stuff isn't just like waiting in a huge ditch for us to discover the way that oil is. It's kind of distributed in little pieces, and so we have to mine out a ton of rock and then filter to get those little pieces of usable metals and minerals. Here's another one, using the word energy when what we should be saying is electricity. And you might think that that is inconsequential, but electricity represents only 20% of all the energy that we use in that specific form of electricity. Everything else is, the other 80% is combustion, and that's true within countries as well as at the global scale. And so this allows us to make that little cheat of saying that a given place ran on supposedly 100% energy derived from renewable technology. But the thing is, at best, what they've done is relied on electricity that was derived from those technologies. So that is really only 100% of 20%. So it's really blowing up what a success that was. And then also, they don't mention here, but it was only for like a few minutes. So this next one is about relative statements. And so if I were preparing for a marathon and I were jogging every day, and then I told you that the amount that I jogged for, the amount of time, increased from one day to the next by a third, that would sound like a significant achievement. It would sound like I am making progress toward my goal of being a long distance runner. But what I left out was that yesterday I ran for 3 minutes and today I ran for 4. And so technically I'm not lying. I increased the amount of time that I ran by a third, an additional third of the original number. But because the number that I was starting with was so low in the first place, it wasn't that hard to bump it up by that amount and yet claim this great improvement. And so that's also what's happening here with the amount of solar, wind, etc. that we are adding each year. Because it is so low, it's also easy to improve upon and then to act, to just present the basic number, and then just count on people to assume that that was a big achievement. And then another tactic of sorts is to just present numbers with no frame of reference at all and just hope that people will see them and assume that they are significant and be impressed. And so here we have an example of a company that was announcing how many solar panels it's going to produce per year, or like how much the capacity of its annual production of solar panels will be. And this engineering professor really latched onto that and was happy to share it with the world. And then we had to have an atmospheric scientist point out to him that actually that company's contribution to what we would need to be generating entirely for the whole country or for the world is not actually a big deal. It's not a significant piece at all. So he made him look like a fool, and in general, Tim Garrett is awesome, so check him out on Twitter. The next trick, so to speak, in terms of overstating our progress on this project, which would be bad for the environment anyway, is representing numbers in terms of capacity versus production. And so people don't appreciate the difference between this, and when you talk capacity, you take advantage of the fact. So these technologies do not perform perfectly. A solar panel might be designed to generate a certain amount of energy, but because the weather doesn't always cooperate, it ends up underperforming. And what I've found is that both globally and then in a later example for the US, performance tends to be only a quarter of what the stated capacity is. And so then if you focus on talking about capacity, you actually get to kind of inflate the number times 4. And not that anybody really knows what these numbers are anyway. Like if you tell someone 100 this or 1,000 that, like that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but you do get to blow it up times 4 if you talk capacity. So they do, which is why, for example, and I was trying for the longest time to figure this out, if you look at the 2016 solar value on these two graphs, there's a link in my Substack where you can click and look more closely if this isn't big enough. But in one case, they say that solar provided 4.5, or it corresponds to the number 4.5%, and the other one it's only 1.35. And it's like, I was trying to think, like, why, how is it that they're two different? Aren't they using the same data set? The label on the graph seems to be more or less the same. I'm looking at solar, I'm looking at the right year. And then I realized the wording. And so solar was designed to be able to potentially generate 4.5% of the total energy. However, in reality, it fell short. And so then it ended up only producing 1.35. So the thing about our planet is we're all on one together, and we all share an atmosphere, and the amount of pollution that matters in terms of generating climate change is the total of what all countries produce. And yet, when a journalist wants to report some good news, what they will do is focus on a particular state or country that is managing to reduce its level of pollution. And that's nice. That's great. Sometimes they do that by just offshoring their industry to other countries. But anyway, the thing that matters the most is that the total number is still rising. Now, as soon as that total number starts to fall, I'm down with, we can go ahead and celebrate, but I don't see that happening. And I do not think that you can extrapolate from seeing this country make that improvement to just assuming that all the others will. And yet, people do tend to read it that way. I think the journalist intends for you to see that as a sign that, like, oh, they're just the first, but then everyone else will follow suit. And everyone wants to be able to think that and believe in it and draw hope from that. But that's not how it has worked so far. And until it does, I'm sticking with that. And finally, I don't know how much we will see something like this happening, but I noticed this article where several countries in Europe and elsewhere have documented cases where houses have already covered so much of their roof in solar panels that now they're putting the panels on the fence too. And I think there's an inclination to interpret this as, oh my gosh, solar energy is so abundant in that country that they must be meeting at least 100% of their electricity needs, if not 100% of their total energy needs, from this method or from some other renewable technology. When in fact, what this is, the surplus, is not an indicator of abundance, it's an indicator of lack of interest, because there's actually very few consumers that bought these. And no one else was interested in buying them. So there was a ton of these on the market and people weren't interested, so prices were low, and then the few people who were interested managed to snap up a bunch for a low price. And they've kind of like maxed out on the potential sales. And so just to look into it, I was like, oh, what percent of Germany's energy, so that's one of the countries that they gave as an example, how much of it is coming from solar? So I looked it up for the year of the article, and it was 12% of their electricity and 5% of the total energy. So not what it might seem. Now you get to try one. I will count down from 3 in a moment so that if you'd like, you can pause, take a look, and try to guess which of the things that I just mentioned applies here. There are several. 3, 2, 1. I'm assuming that you're back now, and so here is the big reveal. The first thing is, of course, that this is all presented as good news, as progress to a goal that is, we assume, we trust, is going to make everything turn out okay, although you could also interpret it as that each one of these little bars corresponds to habitat loss and things losing not only their homes, but their food sources. And as it is, we're in a mass extinction, and wildlife, land mass, you're probably sick of me hearing this, is down to 2% of the mammals. And it's not looking good, and this is all making it worse, but they don't tell you that, and then they put it in yellow, which is a happy sunny color, so don't think too hard. The next thing is they're using capacity instead of production, so that allows them to inflate the numbers by a factor of 4, and I did check that, links in my Substack. And of course, it's like, not that they even really had to do that, because New York Times readers don't really have any frame of reference for like what is a high number of gigawatts and what isn't, I think. So that's another thing. They're just giving you this kind of these raw numbers that might not mean anything. And so you assume that you're just supposed to be impressed. Like 30 gigawatts must be a lot, because otherwise they wouldn't be reporting it on the front page. And they also use the word surges and have taken off. It's a really weird trend. It's like one journalist used that, and then their editor was like, that's good. Hey, everybody else, get at the source and just find how many ways you can insert these terms, these verbs, into your headlines. Not true though, because I checked, and solar is now still less than 1% of US energy generation. And even if you just look at electricity, it's still, I think it was like 4% or whatever. So not great, not significant, even if you're just, not caring about the rest of life on Earth and just thinking about industry. And of course, it's using the trick, like I said, about overstating your progress towards becoming a marathon runner, because to look at this, you're like, yeah, that most recent bar is twice as big as the one before it, so that must be a significant jump, when in fact it is not. And so, yeah, now you can be a more shrewd news consumer, even though they're counting on you to look at this and go like, oh, well, like that rectangle is getting so big. Like now you can turn your brain on, look at this, ask some questions, go out into the wild and see if you can apply this to better understand what you are seeing in the news.